This is the 28th year of our speaker series, and we're delighted this month to have a program about Rosalie Edge and have Dyana Furmansky joining us from Arizona tonight. So I'm going to go through some slides, a little bit about who we are, what we do, and then introduce Dyana. First, I want to thank Martin McDonough for being our Zoom coordinator and web coordinator here. And I also want to thank Bob Goldman. I don't know if Bob's on the call, but Bob is who turned me on to Rosalie Edge and Dyana's book, Hawk of Mercy. And also Kate Busco is on the call. Kate has is a student at University of Maine in Orono and has been doing quite a bit of documentary filming over a number of years now. And while she was still at Bangor High School, I believe, made about a 10-minute, really nice little documentary on Rosalie Edge. That is on our Friends of Merrymeeting Bay website. If you click on the video section, it's actually the first one there. I also have in our library, our electronic library, in the miscellaneous section, about 7 documents or so dealing with Rosalie Edge, several of which are from the Emergency Conservation Committee, which you will hear about. And I'll also mention that I think Gulf of Maine Books in Brunswick should have some copies of Hawk of Mercy, which we'll hear about. So without further ado, I will pop through some slides here. And we are a unique organization, and we take a holistic look at the environment, research, advocacy, land conservation, education. Doesn't make sense to deal with protect a piece of land if the river going by it is all dirty, and vice versa. The kids are our future. We want to educate young kids. We do a lot with 4th graders and so forth. We do a lot of cutting edge research and also some sharp elbow advocacy. And there'll be a few slides here with some pictures of some of the things that we've done over the years, still actively doing bald eagle nest surveys, longer than anyone in the state's been doing that. Really great circulation study of the bay, which is really a soup bowl where 6 rivers come together, join as an inland delta, and then drain about 17 miles down to the ocean. Doing a lot of work with PFAS the last few years, particularly related to the Brunswick Naval Air Station and the massive leaks that has come out of there. A lot of our work revolves around fish passage, migratory fish passage, the bay and the lower Kennebec estuary, even the upper Kennebec, only place in Maine to really host all dozen diagenous fish species in the Gulf of Maine that require salt and fresh water to complete their lifestyle. So we're really good for spawning and nursery habitat. And these gross pictures here are showing examples of turbine mortality from hydro plants. So that's a lot of what we do. I mentioned the education. We've got these bay days. We get kids outside away from these digital devices, getting really dirty, having fun. It's really great to, we stop for lunch and, or to leave, and little girl says, "No, I don't want to stop. I want to be an archaeologist." So hopefully that can stick with the kids till later. And we've protected now over 1,500 acres of land, largely valuable wetland habitat, critical wetland habitat. Our focus is on wildlife and habitat as opposed to recreational trails, of which there are plenty without us. So if you like the program, we do record these. We are recording now. If you don't like that, you can leave. But on our homepage, down on the right side, section for the different things we do. And under education, you'll see a speaker series video list. So within a couple of few days, Martin will have this posted there. So you could send people to watch the program if they're not here and you liked what you heard. And getting towards the tail end of our season here for this year, down here, going to really focus on the Brunswick Naval Air Station, super fun PFAS stuff. next month with Dave Page and Suzanne Johnson of the Brunswick area Citizens for a Safe Environment, or BACSI, as they like to call themselves. So, Dyana Furmansky has written for the New York Times, Audubon, High Country News, Sierra, other publications as a journalist. Her series on water issues in the West with a small team of writers from High Country News won the prestigious George Polk Award, and the first one given for environmental writing back in 1985. In addition to the Colorado Book Award winning Rosalie Edge Hawk of Mercy, the activist who saved nature from the conservationists, she wrote These American Lands, which is a history of public land. So there's a section on, Bureau of Land Management, land, wildlife, national wildlife refuges, national parks, national forests, and so forth. Very comprehensive book. And currently Dyana lives in Colorado and Arizona, and she's coming to us tonight from Arizona, where I just learned the other day that they don't switch time zones. Well, they switch time zones. They don't switch. Yeah, they were in Mountain Time and now they're in Pacific Time, but their time hasn't changed. So anyway, with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Dyana, you can start. And thank you again for coming, and we're really excited to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Ed and Martin for putting this program together, and for Ed's enormous enthusiasm for Rosalie Edge. And it's for people like him that her story really matters. And I see that there are quite a few of you. And I do remember meeting Robert Goldman quite a few years ago when I think I spoke to Maine Audubon. And he also was an early enthusiast of Rosalie Edge. So I just appreciate all the people who have come to learn about her and been amazed by her. So I don't know how many of you are here because you're longtime Rosalie Edge fans, or your parents were, or your grandparents were. Most people have never heard of her. So in the chat box, if you want to let me know how you heard about her, if you have a moment, you can do that. I'm just always curious. Rosalie Edge was a phenomenal conservationist. She was the link between John Muir, who died in 1914 with work unfinished, and she died herself. She died a few weeks after the publication of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And I know a few weeks ago, friends of Merrymeeting Bay learned about Rachel Carson. And I have to be careful now, because we're getting to the point when people under 40 never heard of Rachel Carson. And I know that's what happened to Rosalie Edge. She disappeared from history for several reasons. So she was a militant conservationist. Militant conservation was not a thing that was happening in her lifetime. Her reign of terror, as I called it, is from 1929 to 1962, when she died, as I said, really, I think 8 weeks after Silent Spring's publication. And so Rachel Carson stands on her shoulders, and she stood on John Muir's during a very lethargic time in the conservation movement. And I'm calling it conservation movement as opposed to environmental movement. There are changes in that worldview. So it was conservation. My book is the only biography about Rosalie Edge. I spent many years writing it, doing the research, and I can talk about that. But first, let me introduce her as a person. She was born in 1877. Her father was British. He was the first cousin of Charles Dickens. She was born into a Gilded Age kind of a family. She had wealth and stature, and she also was a cousin of John Singer Sargent. In fact, my computer rests on the biography of John Singer Sargent, which I read while I was working on her biography. She was also a friend of the Vanderbilt family and the Carnegie family. She worked for Louise Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie's wife. Spent some time in Scotland. So she was a very well-educated girl. She was her father's favorite child. There were 5 children, and she was the youngest. And she was, as a child, brought up in New York on the East Side in a brownstone that was probably quite large. So she was quite well off, and she was her father's favorite, which made her a brat and made her accustomed to getting her own way at a very early age. Her father died when she was 8, and it was a loss that she might never have gotten over. And she was raised in a very, after he died, she was very isolated and didn't have many friends, but she was raised to be a certain kind of a woman. So she did not need to have an income. She wasn't expected to go to college. She had an excellent education. She went to a very fine finishing school for girls. Remember, this is the late 1800s. So she lived the life that she could as an upper crust New Yorker. And but she had no prospects. And it wasn't until she was 32 or so, I can't remember the exact year, that she met a man named Charles Noel Edge. And she had been born as Mabel Barrow. Her middle name was Rosalie, and he decided to call her Rosalie. And then she became Rosalie Edge. When she married Charles, she did all the wrong things, according to her mother. She married this man. She didn't know him well. He was British, marrying her father, perhaps. And she followed him to Japan. They got married, and she and Charles traveled around Asia for about 3 years. She came back. Again, we're not seeing a person who has any interest in conservation. She really wasn't even paying attention to birds. She liked trees. She liked being in Central Park. Her father had taken her there as a young child, but she wasn't a person who was drawn immediately to the subjects that would make her famous later. And it happened slowly. She comes back from Asia, and in around 1914, the suffrage movement is getting heated up, and she is really taken with the suffrage movement. She finds the first opening of her mind was the suffrage movement, and she becomes very involved. She is on the New York Suffrage Party committee in New York City. She becomes an officer of that. She writes pamphlets for it. She is someone who would stand on a soapbox, literally, and talk about suffrage. She would go to meetings and interrupt them and talk about suffrage. So she used her childhood brattiness to develop into a suffragist who was not afraid to speak up, or as she put it, stand up at meeting to oppose the male order that was certainly in power. And things happen in her private life. She and Charles, their marriage breaks up, and the book goes into detail about that. And I think it's a very interesting aspect of her life. I, as the storyteller, make it the impetus, the spark that moves her into conservation. She feels that she has been betrayed by her husband. And as a solace, she starts bird watching, and she goes to Central Park. She also has a second home in Rye on Long Island Sound, and she watches birds there. And she's noticing them, and they're becoming more and more important to her. In fact, she gets out of the women's movement, even though she was on the board of early on of the League of Women Voters, which was the New York Suffrage Women's Party. She gets out of women's issues, and she goes into bird issues. And she goes to Central Park, she meets people, she learns, she's a very avid student. And it's there that she meets a man named Willard Van Name, who was an ornithologist at the American Museum of Natural History. And he becomes her mentor and teacher. And she is separated from Charles Noel Edge. She's living in their house in New York. He's living in the house in Rye. And she is recovering very slowly from her broken heart. She has two children. One is Peter and one is Margaret. And Peter loves being with his mother to watch birds. Margaret, not so much. As children sometimes do in divorce, Margaret sides with her father and Peter sides with his mother. So they are divided by this tragedy in their family that they have to keep private because it's 1922. People in that time don't get divorced and they don't separate even. It can't be known publicly. But she increases her love of birds. And when she is traveling the summer of 1929, she gets a pamphlet that's anonymous. It's called Crisis in Conservation. And she realizes she suspects it's written by her teacher in Central Park, Willard Van Name. And he is reporting that the Audubon Society is doing nothing to stop the slaughter of eagles in the Alaskan territory, slaughter by the thousands every year. There's a bounty on their heads, so I think it might be $5 if you bring an eagle head to the game departments in the territory of Alaska. And the Audubon Society of the day doesn't care. They're raptors. They are birds that will compete, with hunters. They'll eat birds sometimes that hunters want to hunt, or they'll eat chickens and other farm life. So Audubon Society is not really protecting all birds at that time. She is incensed. She says, for what to me were the boulevards of Paris and my beautifully brocaded hotel room when I'm hearing about thousands of beautiful birds being destroyed, even though there's an organization that has money enough to protect them. So she comes back to New York and she waltzes into an Audubon Society annual meeting where there are perhaps one or two other women, but certainly no newcomers come to this meeting. It's a club, and she protests. As she says, she stands up and she says, what are you doing? Why aren't you working on helping raptors survive? And it opens up a whole new career for her. She quickly forms a committee called the Emergency Conservation Committee, which is really uses a lot of her suffrage skills. She becomes a pamphleteer. Now, she doesn't have the education or the knowledge yet to write those pamphlets, but she has many people who are contributing to them quietly because they don't want to stand up to the Audubon Society. When I first learned it, it didn't seem possible that people could be so cowed and not speak up. But I know now in our own time of situations where we see people in positions of power not speaking up for fear of what it would do to their career or their life or whatever. So I understand now the dynamic that she was working with. But she would edit and write these pamphlets. They would have outrageous titles. Let's see if I could find, this is the book, by the way. Some of the titles would be, and they would be attention getting, and a lot of people received them. Let's see. So this is the original Crisis in Conservation. But if you see, one of them is called the United States Bureau of Destruction and Extermination. That gets attention. The bald eagle, our national emblem. It's alive, kill it. So she put out dozens of these pamphlets They were read by altogether 1 million people. She was the voice of conservation in the country. No one came close to what she was reporting on. And her fame grew. She nearly destroyed the Audubon Society because she took on their leadership and said, "You're not saving birds." There were a number of things that the Audubon Society was doing that were not in keeping with what she thought a conservationist should be doing, bird-wise and habitat-wise, and even with mammals that she wasn't necessarily representing, but she really covered all of nature. And from there, she started something called Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania on the Appalachian Trail. She bought it, or she rented it, and then it was Willard Vename gave her the money, and she stopped the hawk killing that had gone on there for dozens of years. And it was shooting practice, particularly during World War I, to see how many raptors you could kill during the migration season. So from September to about December, there would be thousands of birds that would fly down that ridge on their migration and be killed. And again, she was incensed. She put a stop to it. She called it Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. It's now 90 years old and doing very well. And it is probably the leading raptor education research organization in the world. They have people coming from all over the world to learn from Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. She gets into national parks. She hears through because people are telling her things privately. They don't want to speak up because they don't want to get in trouble with the Forest Service or the Park Service or the environmental organizations that such as they are, Audubon Society. So they have to go through her. She is the voice of the scientists, she said. And because of her, we have Olympic National Park. We have Kings Canyon National Park. She was the impetus behind them. Even though Kings Canyon in John Muir territory, something that John Muir had wanted to have preserved, the Sierra Club was there. But like a lot of conservation groups at the time, the Sierra Club was really an old boys club where they liked to go hiking and drinking. And so when there was an opportunity to save Kings Canyon and make it a national park, Rosalie Edge flew out from New York, stepped in, and really shocked the Sierra Club into helping her. And one of the people that she inspired was Dave Brower, who was a bit of a firebrand himself. I'm not saying that she made him one, but they were of a kind. And she was the inspiration for David Brower and ultimately for the founders of the Nature Conservancy, the Wilderness Society, and the Environmental Defense Fund. All of their founders, who I spoke to, finally, 30 years after her death, said, yes, she was the spark. She was the person who showed them how they needed to behave and to save nature. So she cut a wide swath. The New Yorker magazine called her the most honest, unselfish, indomitable hellcat in the history of conservation. I wanted to read a letter, the kind of letter that any government official would have gotten from her. I don't know how many of you remember J. Ding Darling. He was a very famous cartoonist. He developed the duck hunting stamp to raise funds for the protection of wildlife refuges in the 1930s. During the Depression, all her work took place at a very tenuous time in America. She helped J. Ding Darling get his job as the first head of what had been the Bureau of Biological Survey, which basically went out to count species before they were killed or before they disappeared, but had no role in trying to save them. And because of Rosalie Edge and her work with wildlife refuges, that changed. So J. Dean Darling is the first director. She has the standing, the power, the friends in Washington, mainly Harold Ickes, who's the Interior Secretary under Roosevelt, to get Darling his job. He's a cartoonist on an Iowa newspaper, but he's also a passionate conservationist. So, but he's not doing things according to the way she thinks they should be done. So let me just read this little excerpt of a letter. She was plaguing him, saying, "You're not doing this right, you're not doing that right." And at one time she writes to him, "Dear Mr. Darling, will you kindly let me know which gull colonies of Maine are being visited by the Biological Survey for the purpose of puncturing their eggs? I am particularly interested in this matter and would be very glad to have all the information you can give me. I would like to know the name of the specific island or rocks." So this agency that is supposed to be preserving wildlife, for whatever reason, thought there were too many gulls in one place and was reducing the population. Another one, she says, she's always like twisting a knife. "Dear Mr. Darling, I read with great interest a news item regarding your acceptance of the gift of $30,000 from a leading arms manufacturer, and of the additional $42,000 of the taxpayers' money, which the survey will contribute for courses in game management. This is progress indeed. The amount offered to the Audubon Association 20 years ago was $20,000. Accept our congratulations. May I offer you our teaching units and all our free literature for the required reading of these courses? In frankness, however, I should state that our literature is for the preservation of all wildlife, and not merely for the small proportion of it known as game. Perhaps your courses can be extended to cover the preservation of all wildlife resources, considering that your department represents the interests of all citizens." So that's the kind of needling that she would do. She was extraordinarily effective. No one in that time period was as effective as she was. She was everywhere. And as I said, she was also the spark for people who created the Nature Conservancy, I said the Wilderness Society, and other organizations. But she also fixed the Audubon Society. They changed their ways. They became a different organization. They got rid of their leadership. They realized that they needed to broaden their mission, and they ended, for that time, their very close alliances with gun and ammunition makers. So they stopped speaking for the hunters, the hunting lobby, which has a place. I'm not against hunting, but it was the only reason that wildlife was saved was because it mattered to hunters, and there needed to be a new kind of advocate, which Rosalie Edge was. So she was doing these things for 32 years. Her final work was because she knew people at the Fish and Game, as it became known after the Bureau of Biological Survey, and she began hearing stories about birds dead on golf courses in Westchester County. And the rumor was in the mid-40s that it was DDT. So she was writing to the Fish and Game people saying, check this out. It's just a rumor, but you might want to go see. And sure enough, there were birds dying from DDT. Rachel Carson went to Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. She loved Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. She often visited, but she never met Rosalie Edge, who was many years older and was not climbing up to the summits to see the hawks' migration. But she went to Hawk Mountain, and it is from Hawk Mountain that Rachel Carson received her data on the migration of raptors. and its decline in numbers, definitely measurable from before DDT to that time in even the late 1940s. And so Rachel Carson stood on Rosalie Edge's shoulders because Hawk Mountain was essential to her finding hard data, which no other place in the world had. Certainly, the United States was ahead in the DDT usage, but because they were unimportant birds, nobody had counted them before. And at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, they were counted from the very first day that she took over in the 1930s and until Rachel Carson needed the data in the 1960s. So 30 years they had. And Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, came out. The Hawk Mountain Sanctuary board meeting notes suggest or talk about inviting her to Hawk Mountain to speak, knowing what an important place it was in her research. And Rosalie Edge died a couple of weeks later and disappeared. She was eclipsed by the success of Silent Spring and the rise of Rachel Carson, who was a much easier person, personality-wise, to deal with, and also very well educated and a better writer, in my opinion. And Rosalie Edge disappears from history. The Audubon Society never mentioned her in any of its Audubon magazine articles. She just went away. And it wasn't until the late 80s that I heard about her. At this point, Ed, do you have any questions you'd like to ask?
Well, I actually, in the beginning, forgot to let people know that if they had questions, they could put them in the chat box,
Well,
and then I will moderate those. And there aren't any so far because I just looked.
okay.
People did say how they heard of her or if they hadn't heard of her. But please, if you have any questions, write them down. But
Yes.
meanwhile, I want to say, I'll put in a plug for Irving Brandt was the third sort of active member of the committee with Von Name and Rosalie Edge, and he's got a wonderful book, Adventures in Conservation with FDR, Franklin Roosevelt.
Right.
Highly recommend that. But maybe while people are asking their questions, you could give us a short version of how you became interested in Rosalie Edge.
Yes. I had written a book in the earlier on, this book, which is out of print. Rosalie Edge isn't, and it's a history of public land. And I wrote it in the early 1980s. And I was surprised. And in one of the things I read, only one place, and I think it was a sort of a biography of John Muir by Stephen Fox. Yes, something with John Muir and then by Stephen Fox. And in there's just a brief section about a woman named Rosalie Edge, who he said, the author said, was, one of the most important people in conservation in the 20th century. And I thought, oh my goodness, what? So I had mentioned it to my editor, who was also a great writer and the biographer of Harold Ickes, the Secretary of Interior in the 40s, 30s, and 40s. And I said, isn't that amazing that nobody ever heard? Did you ever heard of Rosalie Edge? No, never heard of her. So that was it. Book came out. I forgot about it. I never thought about it. And then a few years later, when my editor, Tom Watkins, was working on his biography of Harold Ickes, he was at the Denver Public Library, Conservation Library. And I happened to live near Denver at that time. So he called me and he said, Rosalie, remember that person, Rosalie Edge, that you learned about when you were writing the other book? He said, her papers are at the Denver Public Library, which made no sense. She had no connection to Denver. And so I spent a few years on, whenever I came to Denver, carpooling my children to their various activities and waiting for them. I would go to the library and I would go through her papers. And I became increasingly interested in her as a person because of the biting nature of some of her responses and because of the nasty things Audubon members were saying about her, the ones who did not join her cause. And I thought, this is an interesting woman. I ended up meeting her son, Peter Edge, was living. I found him by going in something called a phone book. And he was, or I think I called, no, I decided it wasn't a phone book because I didn't have a Chicago phone book. It was information. I called information. There used to be an operator who gave you numbers. And I called the number and he picked up the phone in this very gruff and gravelly voice. I said, I'm working on a book. I've read pretty much everything in the Denver Public Library, but I'd like to get to know Rosalie Edge as a person. And over the course of several years, I went to Chicago and met with Peter Edge in a house largely furnished with his mother's furniture. So I was able to sort of bring in her essence, sitting in chairs that she had sat in, or at tables, or using china that she had used. He had it all, including an amazing book collection going back to the 1500s, because her father loved books. So I got to know the woman. And at one point, after many meetings, I said, I'm still not sure about this book because I get, the Audubon story, very interesting. She did all these cool things, but I really don't have a sense of why and who she was. And he went out of the room. He brought in a suitcase, a very old suitcase, and he said, here. And in it were about 300 letters from in the Edge family, or the Barrow family, her father, going back to the 1850s. So letters written by Rosalie Edge's father to her mother in the 1850s and 60s. Again, he's Charles Dickens' cousin. Charles Dickens visits them. There's lots of little banter about cousin Charles, all the way up to the year she died. So these are personal letters, and some of them are very revealing, very intriguing. And I was able to build an inside story of her motivation, which had a lot to do with what happened in her marriage. I start the book by saying the widow of Charles Noel Edge. She insists, and Charles had died. They were never divorced, but she would never grant him a divorce. And that outrage of what he did to her is a spark, is like, what am I going to do with my life? How am I going to go get on with what has happened to me? And conservation was where she went. The portrayal of wildlife by the people who were supposed to be protecting it, I think, resonated with her and created a connection. The Denver connection is important. Why were her papers in Denver? Well, it turned out that she had been asked by women's colleges for her work when she was done with it. When she had died, could they be happy to take it? And she didn't answer. She didn't want to be at a women's college. That wasn't where she wanted her papers to go. At that time, a man named Arthur Carhart, a Forest Service employee, had gotten the Denver Public Library to start a conservation library, the first one in the country. And he contacted various people to say, we'd love to have your papers in this new conservation library. One of those people was the famous Rosalie Edge. And she agreed to become one of the foundation collections in the Denver Conservation Library, even though she'd only been in Denver, passing through on trains on her way to Yosemite or Olympic. She had no connection to Denver. And she had boxed up all her papers, which were at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, and sent them to the Denver Public Library to basically start this conservation library. And she died before they arrived. So they were in Denver. And that's where I was able to do the research. Luckily, they got there.
Great. And that's where I reached out to, and I, as I told you the other night, I was able to get, Denver, electronically sent me basically 30 pages, scanned 30 pages. And some of that is up in our library there. And I do have the Crisis and Conservation there. And I've got another one, Shotgun Conservation.
Yeah, yeah,
And then there's one about vermin. And it's just
right.
arbitrary a couple of years they sent me. But
Well,
yeah,
of course, that wasn't at all possible in 1990 when I
no.
began working on this book. I had to go in and, actually go through all those papers, and it took me a while. Also, I mentioned all these letters that had been written, and this is 1990, and I hadn't started using a computer yet. I was using a IBM Selectric, the top line then of how you can produce written words. And but I had all these letters, and I was very careful in opening them and putting them back in the envelopes and closing and not wanting to touch them very much because they're very, very old. And I didn't think it was the right thing to do to just, open them and close them and put them away. So I spent a few years typing each letter out in my own version so that I would have something to use and not go through her letters. So not that it matters, but this is actually typed before I got a computer. And these are examples. I don't know if you could read it, but you can see that that's quite a lot of letters that I had to transcribe so that I would have ways to access the information and not deal with the actual original papers. This one that I typed is dated 1909, and she's writing it on her honeymoon to her mother in New York, and she's honeymooning in Japan, where her mother didn't go because her mother didn't approve of this match.
There was a question from someone asking about what happened to her kids. You mentioned a little bit about Peter, but
Yes.
maybe you could let folks know what happened with Peter and her daughter. And I'll mention that the grandson is a trustee at Hawk Mountain.
As
And
is her Deborah, isn't both her grandchildren, two of her grandchildren are very active at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary.
the question was, do you have, and so aside from what happened to her kids, do you happen to know about the raptors at Hawk Mountain increasing, decreasing, what their status is at all?
Good question. I did not check on that. I believe I'll just, I don't know. I would imagine it's holding steady, but that's a very, very good question that Hawk Mountain would definitely be able to answer to the minute. I haven't been to Hawk Mountain in a number of years, certainly way before COVID was the last time I was there. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. I urge everyone to go if you haven't been. It's in your neighborhood, at least as far as a Westerner is concerned. Let me get back to her children. Peter was a very important source of information for me. And I'm very, very grateful to Peter and the Edge family for giving me free rein, letting me tell the story as I wanted to tell it. And there were some parts that may have been embarrassing to them, as often happens in families. So Peter was a very close source. Margaret, on the other hand, her daughter, the younger daughter, had a terrible, terrible relationship with her mother, Rosalie. She hated her mother. And because of what was going on with this divorce, Margaret sided with her father and with her father's mistress. So Margaret told me, I met Margaret. Peter did get Margaret to meet with me. And one thing I remember Margaret saying is I met her in the house that her father had bought her in Rye. Right on, I mean, man, that house was so close to the sound. I don't know how she survived some of the hurricanes, but she had lived there for many years, and she invited me to her house. And she was very, very formal, very rigid, very cordial, not wanting to say much. But what she did say is that she hated her mother so much that when she went to New York, to Manhattan, and happened to see her mother walking down the sidewalk, she would cross over to the other sidewalk. That's how divided they were. And Rosalie Edge knew Peter's grandchildren. There were three, Deborah and Stephen, and there is a third, a younger son, David. But she never knew Margaret's grandchildren, Margaret's children. It was a very, very painful separation. And one of the other things that Rosalie Edge was, she was a poet. And she won a very prestigious poetry prize while she is at this top level of conservation. And so they find out that she was in a poetry writing night class at Columbia University, but because she wasn't fully enrolled, they rescinded the prize. You had to be a full-time student, or you wouldn't get the prize. But the poem, one of the poems that she wrote, which I could quickly read, it's called "O Hawk of Mercy," which is the subtitle of my book. Here's her poem. One, she wrote many poems, and they are in my book. O clear-eyed hawk, against the zenith poised, black scimitar of steel, the huntsman swings, who rides the rushing stallion of the winds. Now, as he sweeps his arm in one swift strike, I see the lightning plunge, thy clement death, that strikes to earth the gold-plumaged bird, the one of all the covey, too weak and slow to fly for cover, not knowing he is already dead, dead in the midst of sunlight without fear. O hawk of mercy, spiraling to the clouds to rest again upon the huntsman's wrist, plead with him for me that he send me death with wings like thine to overtake my pain, that I may die unknowing in the sun, that I be saved from cowering in the dark, listening, fearful, to the laggard tramp of time. And she was in her 70s when she wrote that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. There's a really gruesome picture in your book of so many hawks laid out on the ground, Kittanany Ridge there, that have been shot. And it was just, I actually had never been to Hawk Mountain. I've certainly heard of it forever, but quite the updrafts there and right on the migration route, and people would sit on the ledges and fire away. There we go.
Yeah, there's there's that, and then there's one suspended from a bridge. And now, of course, those rocks are covered with bird watchers. And who would have thought that that would have been an industry back then? Nobody could have imagined that people would go there just to watch birds rather than to kill them.
Did Peter keep up his interest in bird watching as he grew up?
He was a major bird watcher, major. He went all over the world. His license plate was hoopoe, which is a Middle Eastern bird. That was his favorite. But I don't think there's any continent that he didn't go to watch birds, and very, very late into his life.
Interesting. There's another question from Jim. Did Rosalie Edge, was she involved in the formation of any other national parks besides Olympic and then the Sugar Pines at Yosemite? Essentially, she expanded protection of Yosemite.
And Kings Canyon.
That's right. Yeah, Kings Canyon.
Right, Kings Canyon. But she lobbied for a lot of parks. She was also involved with, this is like ancient history, but Dinosaur National Monument, which was supposed to be flooded. And instead of flooding it, that was Dave Brower's coming out party, really, losing Sierra Club's 501c3 status, but that's where he emerged as a militant conservationist. She worked on that campaign as a supporter of it. It wasn't such a good idea because they traded Dinosaur National Monument, which didn't get flooded, but instead we got Lake Powell, Glen Canyon Dam. So that was something that David Brower was very upset about. And she was on those campaigns, but she wasn't leading them. because she was at that point, pushing 80,
Yeah.
uh, very active, and very, very active at Hawk Mountain. So Hawk Mountain was taking up a lot of her time. I want to say one thing that I discovered many years later to show how deep she was into conservation and how well known she was. I was doing some research at the Rockefeller Archive about 10 years ago. And I was going through because I believe the Rockefellers were an enormously important family dynasty in conservation. And I was doing some writing about that. And I was going through John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s um, conservation papers. And in them were all these brochures, all these pamphlets from Rosalie Edge.
Oh,
So
interesting.
he was reading her and
Mhm.
he saved the work. It inspired him not to be a militant because he wasn't a militant, but to save um, uh, Grand Teton National Park. Yes, very, very much. She was very involved with that as well.
And that's really interesting. As you probably know, he was involved in protecting a lot of land up here in Acadia.
Maine, exactly. And that was before, that was on his own. But frankly, he was
Mhm.
raised by his father, John D. Sr., to be a lover of nature, as was Senior. So that was him. But when she came along, she moved him to broaden his outreach, and Grand Teton was very much something that she worked on the grassroots level while he was able to buy it and present it to the American people.
Um, as reading more and another very detailed book is Olympic Battleground by Karsten Lane about
Yes.
the forestry practices, and I recommend anyone interested in forestry and the Forest Service to read that book. But Willard Van Name, clearly a motivational factor for her. He wrote a lot of the stuff that she published as a sort of ghostwriting. Um, Really nothing out there on him. And I wondered if you had thought about writing about him or know of anyone who would.
Well,
I don't know if you're still writing even, but
I am writing. I'm actually working on fiction right now. Journalism being what it is, I'm working on a novel. But Willard Van Name um, needs a biographer,
yeah.
and the problem with Willard Van Name, which is not a problem, was that he was gay. And that's one of the reasons, and I don't even come out and say that, because frankly, in the 90s, you couldn't quite say it in a book.
Mhm.
People were coming out, and he never came out. Nobody officially knew, of course. So she covered for him. And that's one of the reasons why he had to really be careful with speaking out because everybody knew he was gay, according to Peter Edge. It was obvious. And he had some relationships in the national parks that were a little problematic at that time
Mhm.
for Rosalie. And I only addressed them very superficially. But because of and he had no children of his own, he never married. He was kind of an isolated guy. And someone needs to write that story as well, because all kinds of people contribute to saving our natural heritage, and we wouldn't be better. We would be worse off without them. But given what it was in those days, he couldn't really come out. He couldn't be a spokesman. He couldn't. He couldn't be public.
Mhm. Right. Oh,
If I were
interesting.
to write the book today, I would make all that clear. But at the time, it wasn't really possible.
You mentioned Ding Darling, who's again very well-known political cartoonist. He won two Pulitzers for editorial
Right.
cartoons. Um,
Right.
there's a biography on him, but folks should know that there is a Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge down on Sanibel Island in Florida, and it's the protecting probably the largest area of protection for mangroves at least in temperate climates. And
I see.
major migratory bird.
Yeah, I see a question here from Robert Goldman. Hi. Um, and it is, was it envy and sexism that motivated the men in conservation to turn their backs on acknowledging Rosalie's huge contributions? Well, I don't know what else it would be. The men clearly wrote our history. The men clearly wrote her out of our history. And that's true. It happens a lot. There's a lot of people, women, people of color, gay people who get written out of history. But her big problem was she was kind of very bossy, very imperious, not likable, frankly. And to be not likable and a woman and not very attractive, man, you can't get worse than that. So, yes, they did write her out of history. They hated her. I have a quote from someone, the president of Audubon, saying, we hate Rosalie Edge and she hates us. So that when she died, they just breathed a sigh of relief. And the people who did form the Nature Conservancy and the Environmental Defense Fund, one of them is Roland Clement, who wrote The Afterword. When I spoke to them, and they were both around 100 years old when I spoke to them, they both confessed to feeling terrible at not giving her the credit that was due.
Well, Stephanie earlier wrote in the chat she's trying to educate, had never heard of Edge, but trying to educate herself about female conservation as to who should have had the same fame as many of their contemporaneous male counterparts.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And, even David Brower, I didn't speak to him, but he left me a voicemail in which he said, boy, was she something. And yes, she was really important to him. Aldo Leopold also. Aldo Leopold was one of her advisors. And Bob Marshall, another advisor. And they went on to start the Wilderness Society and didn't invite her to be one of them, to join them.
Yeah. Well, it's still happening, so happens as with more activist organizations. It happens certainly with male-female issues. So, yeah, the subtitled, the activist who saved nature from the conservationists, it's still there, but we've still come a long way. So, and
We have.
and you've done a great job at bringing her to light, and hopefully we bring her back in the light a little bit here with all of this renewed interest. So.
Well, see, Olympic National Park is very interested in her, and they put out a movie, or maybe it isn't done yet. So they did have a woman superintendent. I don't know what's going on there. Maybe they don't have anybody. Maybe they shut the lights off there. I don't know. But they were also really interested in promoting her legacy in Olympic National Park.
Yeah, and there've been a number of magazine articles written about her in the last few years, and again, I think I got a couple of them on the website there. So yeah, so read up on her, buy the book,
Thank you,
and
thank you.
And spread the word.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your
you.
time with me, and for wanting to know about Rosalie Edge. And
Well,
please share her widely. And thank you, Ed and Martin, for putting this program together. I am so appreciative. And best of luck to Friends of Merrymeeting Bay.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was a real pleasure, and yeah, look forward to hearing about your fiction at some point, right?
Me too.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank
And
you.
thank you.
Yes. Good night.